The moment Julia Wilcox stepped off the stagecoach in Harlan Creek, New Mexico Territory, in the spring of 1878, every pair of eyes on the main street turned toward her with the particular coldness that only small towns could manufacture. The kind that didn't need words to communicate exactly what it thought of a woman traveling alone with nothing but a worn carpetbag and a reputation that had arrived 3 days ahead of her. She stood in the orange dust of the street and let them look. She had learned, through months of hard and humbling practice, that flinching only made it worse. So she squared her shoulders beneath her faded blue dress, tucked a loose strand of dark brown hair back under the brim of her hat, and told herself the same thing she had told herself in every town before this one. All she needed was work. Just work. Nothing more complicated than that. She was 24 years old, and she had once been the wife of Gerald Wilcox of Santa Fe, a man of considerable standing and considerably less character. When Gerald had been discovered to have been stealing from the territorial land office where he worked, he had done what men of his particular cowardice always do. He had pointed at his wife and explained with great smoothness and practiced sincerity that Julia had been the one feeding him information, that she had been his accomplice, that she had known everything. She had known nothing. But knowing nothing and being believed about knowing nothing turned out to be two entirely separate things, especially when the man making the accusation was charming and well-connected, and the woman being accused had no family left in the territory and no money for a proper lawyer. Gerald had served 4 months in the territorial jail and then been released on a technicality that had everything to do with who his uncle knew in the capital. Julia had been acquitted technically, but the word that followed her was not acquitted. The word that followed her was complicit, and that word, she had discovered, traveled faster than any stagecoach. She had tried Santa Fe. She had tried Albuquerque. She had tried 3 smaller towns whose names she had already begun to blur together in her memory. Each one the same combination of closed doors and turned shoulders, and the particular satisfaction that people took in refusing a woman they considered fallen. Not fallen in the way that word was sometimes used. She had not done anything of that nature, but fallen in the broader sense that the frontier applied to women who had been touched by scandal, regardless of the direction the touching had come from. Harlan Creek was her last attempt before she had decided she would simply keep going west until she ran out of land. The town was small but not shabby. It had a main street of perhaps a dozen buildings, a church with white paint that was beginning to peel at the corners, a livery stable, a general store with barrels of flour and salt stacked outside on the porch, and at the far end, a 2-story building with a sign that said Holloway's Freight and Supply. There was also a saloon, naturally, but Julia had learned in the previous towns that walking into a saloon looking for work announced a particular set of conclusions in people's minds that took months to undo, so she avoided it. She started at the general store, because she always started at the general store. It was the sensible choice. General stores always needed someone to help with the accounts or the stock, and her handwriting was clean and her arithmetic sound, and she could lift a 50-pound sack of grain without the expression of helplessness that some men seemed to expect from women who asked for honest work. The man behind the counter at Harlan Creek's general store was named Purvis, and he had a round face and small eyes that went smaller still when Julia explained who she was and what she was looking for. She could see the moment of recognition. Somebody had indeed talked, or a letter had arrived, or perhaps the telegraph line that connected these small towns carried gossip as efficiently as it carried anything else. "We don't have anything for you," Purvis said, and he said it looking somewhere just past her left shoulder, the way people did when they wanted to deliver a verdict without having to meet the eyes of the condemned. She tried the livery stable next. The man there, a lean fellow named Conroe with a sunburned neck, listened to her for about 30 seconds before he shook his head with what might have been genuine regret or might have been performance. She could no longer easily tell the difference. She tried the church, because sometimes churches had positions helping to keep the records, teaching reading to children, cleaning the pews. The minister's wife answered the door and looked at Julia with an expression of soft, practiced pity that was somehow worse than outright hostility, and said that she would have to discuss the matter with her husband, and that Julia should come back next week, which they both understood to mean that Julia should not come back at all. By the time she had walked the length of the main street once and was considering walking it a second time out of sheer stubbornness, her feet were aching inside her boots, and the afternoon sun was pressing down on the top of her hat with considerable authority. She had eaten nothing since a piece of dried biscuit on the stagecoach that morning. The $2.30 in her coat pocket represented the entirety of her remaining resources, and the stagecoach back to anywhere would cost her at least $1.75. It was in this precise state of diminished hope that she found herself standing in front of Holloway's Freight and Supply. The building was larger than it looked from down the street. Up close, she could see that it had been well maintained, the wood was sound, and the sign was freshly painted, black letters on white, clean and without flourish. Through the open double doors, she could see the interior was organized with a deliberateness that spoke of someone who understood systems. Crates were stacked on labeled shelves. A large work table in the center held papers arranged in neat rows. Near the back, a staircase led to what she assumed was an office on the upper level. There were two men inside. One was very young, perhaps 17, with a sunburned nose and a look of permanent mild confusion, who was moving crates from one stack to another with the focused energy of someone who was working to avoid thinking. The other man was behind the work table, writing something in a ledger, and he was the one Julia looked at and understood immediately that she was looking at the person who mattered here. He was perhaps 30, possibly a year or two more or less. He was tall, wide through the shoulders in the way that spoke of actual labor rather than the posturing width of men who wanted to seem imposing. His hair was dark, slightly overgrown, and he had not shaved in what looked like 2 or 3 days, which on some men looked slovenly, and on him looked simply like a man who had been too busy to get to it. He was writing in the ledger with the absorbed quality of someone who genuinely liked working with numbers, which Julia recognized because she was that way herself, and it produced a particular kind of stillness in the face. He looked up when she stepped inside, and she registered 2 things in rapid succession. His eyes were gray, an unusual color, and they did not perform the quick top-to-bottom appraisal that most men's eyes performed on a woman who walked into a room. They simply looked at her face with a directness that was neither unkind nor anything other than attentive. "Can I help you?" he said. "I am looking for work," Julia said. She had learned through repetition that the direct approach cost her nothing additional. The indirection and the gradual building of rapport only meant that the refusal came with more disappointment attached. "I am Julia Wilcox. I have come from Santa Fe by way of several stops in between, and I have good arithmetic and clean handwriting, and I can manage stock and keep accounts, and I am stronger than I look, which I realize is not saying a great deal, but I mention it because I do not want you to imagine I am asking for light work. I will do whatever work is available." She paused, because she had learned to pause here and let the name do what it was going to do. He did not react to the name. Or rather, he reacted in the way that a person reacts to a name that is simply a name, without attached history. He set his pen down in that deliberate way that organized people set pens down, not dropping it, placing it, and leaned back slightly in his chair and looked at her with an expression that she could not immediately classify. "Andrew Holloway," he said, "this is my operation. What kind of accounts work have you done?" She blinked. He had not reacted to the name. She had a sudden peculiar sensation as though the floor had shifted slightly, and she was not sure if it had shifted upward or downward. "I kept the household accounts for 2 years, she said, and then, because she had found that the partial truth was worse than the complete truth in the long run, she said, My husband was Gerald Wilcox of Santa Fe. He was convicted of stealing from the Territorial Land Office. I was accused of being involved and was acquitted. The acquittal has not made much practical difference to most people, but I mention it because I would rather you know and decide accordingly than find out later and feel deceived. Andrew Holloway looked at her for a moment. It was not a cruel look. It was the look of a man who was taking in information and processing it honestly. I know about Gerald Wilcox, he said. His name came through on some freight contracts about a year ago. He had a reputation for being slippery. He was, Julia said, and you were acquitted. I was. Then as far as I am concerned, that is the end of that matter, Andrew said. He picked up his pen again, then set it back down as though he had thought of something else. Can you start tomorrow? I have a shipment of supply manifests that have gotten badly behind, and my current system is not working as well as I would like. I would need you from 7 in the morning until about 5 in the afternoon. The wage is $12 a month, which is what I pay the other hired help, and that includes meals here at the supply house since I have a cook who comes in midday. Julia felt something happen in her chest that she did not entirely trust, a loosening like a fist slowly opening. She had been clenched for so long that the unclenching felt almost alarming. Yes, she said, I can start tomorrow. Where are you staying? I haven't arranged that yet. He considered this without any change of expression. Ma Denny runs a boarding house on the south end of town. She has a room available. I know because she mentioned it to me last week. She is a practical woman and she will not give you trouble. Tell her I sent you. Julia looked at him. She had been sent to places before by people who thought they were helping, and the endorsement had not always helped in the way that was intended. But there was something in the way Andrew Holloway said it flatly, without performance, as a simple practical matter that suggested he had considered this and meant it as it sounded. Thank you, she said. Come by at 7 tomorrow, he said. We can look at the manifests, and you can tell me what you think the problem is. She nodded and she turned to go, and she was almost at the double doors when he said, without looking up from his ledger, The town will talk, Miss Wilcox. I expect you know that. But the town's opinion is not my hiring policy. She stood in the doorway for a moment with her back to him, looking out at the orange dust of the main street and the late afternoon light turning everything the color of old copper. I know, she said. I have stopped expecting otherwise. She walked out into the street and made her way to the south end of town, and the feeling in her chest was still there, still that careful loosening, and she did not look back. Ma Denny was, as advertised, a practical woman. She was perhaps 60, with white hair pulled back severely and hands that looked like they had done 30 years of hard work without complaint, which they had. She looked at Julia with the appraising eye of someone who had seen a good many people come through her door and had developed reliable instincts about which ones were going to be trouble. Andrew Holloway sent you, she said. It was not quite a question. He did, Julia said. Then you have work. Starting tomorrow. Ma Denny looked at her for another moment and then stepped back from the door to let her in. Room is $2 a month. I provide supper. You provide your own morning meal unless you make it before 6, in which case you can use the kitchen. I do not permit drinking in the rooms. I do not care about much else. That is very fair, Julia said. I expect it is. Andrew Holloway is a decent man. He does not do things without reason. Julia paid the $2 and was shown to a room at the top of the stairs that was small and clean, with a window that looked out onto the back of the building where there was a vegetable garden in the early stages of spring planting. The bed had a quilt on it that had been made with evident care, small squares of fabric in blue and white and faded yellow, the stitches even. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the quilt for a long time. She thought about what Andrew Holloway had said about the town's opinion not being his hiring policy. She had been offered work before, technically. But the offers had come wrapped in various forms of condescension. The implication that she was being done a favor, that she should be grateful beyond the reasonable measure of gratitude between an employer and an employee who was simply doing her job, that she was somewhat lesser than the work she was being asked to do. Once, a man in Albuquerque had offered her work as a housekeeper and had made it clear with no particular subtlety that the work came with certain other expectations attached, which she had declined with the particular fury she had been trying very hard to keep in a box. Andrew Holloway had offered her work the way you offered work to a person who had asked for work. He had told her the wage. He had mentioned the meals. He had described the task. He had not done her a favor. He had made a business arrangement. She did not know, sitting on the edge of Ma Denny's bed in the fading afternoon light of Harlan Creek, New Mexico territory, which of those two things, the work or the respect, meant more to her. She knew only that she was crying quietly into her hands, and that it was not from sadness but from something that she suspected, after a moment, might be relief so large she did not have a better name for it. She arrived at Holloway's Freight and Supply at 10 minutes to 7 the following morning, which was how she always arrived everywhere, early enough to be serious, not so early as to be inconvenient. The young man with the sunburned nose was already there, sweeping the front entrance. He told her his name was Tommy Briggs, and that he had been working for Mr. Holloway for almost 2 years, and that Mr. Holloway was the best employer in the territory, which he said with the completely unself-conscious sincerity of a 17-year-old who had not yet learned to moderate his enthusiasm. Julia found it charming in a way that she had not expected. Andrew himself arrived at exactly 7, which she suspected was also his habit, and he greeted her with a nod that contained neither warmth nor coldness, but simply the acknowledgement of a person who had said he would be somewhere at a certain time and was there. He took her upstairs to the office, which was a room of organized complexity, maps on the walls marking freight routes, filing cabinets along one wall with handwritten labels, and on the desk a stack of manifests that Julia looked at and immediately understood the problem with. "Your filing system is not wrong," she said, because she believed in being precise about these things. "But the manifests are being filed by date of shipment rather than by destination, which means that when you need to find everything going to or coming from a particular location, you have to go through the whole file." Andrew leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and looked at the stack of papers. "That is exactly the problem," he said. "I have been doing it this way since I started because that was how the man who taught me kept records, and I never stopped to think about whether it was the most sensible method." "Who taught you?" "My uncle, Frank Holloway. He ran a freight operation out of Las Cruces. He died 3 years ago and left me this location to set up." "I am sorry about your uncle." "He had a good life," Andrew said, simply and without performance, the way people said it when they meant it. "What would you suggest instead?" They spent the next 2 hours going through the manifests together, and Julia explained the cross-referencing system she had used when she kept Gerald's household accounts. Not that she said it was Gerald's, she simply described the method, and Andrew asked questions that were intelligent and specific, and showed that he was genuinely trying to understand the system rather than simply approving it so that he could delegate and forget. He wanted to know how it worked. He wanted to be able to use it himself. She found this deeply appealing, though she did not think about it in those terms at the time. At the time, she was simply thinking about the manifests. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the filing system, caught 3 discrepancies in the inventory records that had been producing small but consistent errors in the monthly totals, and learned the names of all 7 of Andrew's regular freight clients and the specific quirks of each. She had also learned that Tommy Briggs was the son of a widow woman who lived on a farm 2 miles outside town, and that he sent half his wages home every month, which he mentioned without any air of martyrdom, simply as a fact of how his money worked. She had learned that Andrew Holloway was not from New Mexico territory originally. He was from Missouri, had come west at 19 with his uncle, and had never gone back, had no immediate family remaining, had an extensive correspondence with 2 or 3 freighting operations in Colorado that he was considering partnering with, and drank coffee with a seriousness of purpose that Julia recognized as a kindred characteristic. She had also learned that he was quiet but not cold, that he said what he meant without decoration, that he was entirely fair with his workers and with his clients, and that there was a quality to his attention. When he was listening to something, he was genuinely listening, not waiting for his turn to speak, that she found herself noticing more and more. The town, as predicted, talked. She heard it first from Ma Denny, who reported it without malice, and with the practical neutrality of a woman who had long since decided that her own opinion was the only one worth keeping. Some people in Harlan Creek had heard about Julia Wilcox from a man named Garrett who had connections in Santa Fe, and the story he told was Gerald's story, that Julia had been the one behind the theft, that she had been the clever one, that the acquittal was a technicality bought by means that were better not examined. Julia listened to this and felt the familiar heaviness settle in her stomach, the one she carried the way some people carry old injuries that ache in certain weathers. "What does Andrew Holloway say about it?" she asked. "I imagine he says nothing," Ma Denny said, "because Andrew Holloway does not discuss his employees with people who have nothing to do with his business." She paused, measuring flour into a bowl with the methodical precision of someone who had made this particular bread several thousand times. "He is not a man who is moved by other people's noise." This proved accurate. The following Monday morning, a man named Hargrove, who owned the saloon and seemed to have appointed himself the informal arbiter of Harlan Creek's social standards, despite the obvious irony of that position, came into the supply house and spoke to Andrew in a low and emphatic voice for about 4 minutes. Julia could not hear the words from the back of the room where she was working, but she could hear the tone, which was the particular tone of a man who was delivering a warning he expected to be acted upon. Andrew listened to this without interrupting. When Hargrove finished, Andrew said something brief. She caught the words "not my concern," and then returned to whatever he had been doing. Hargrove left with the stiff-backed dignity of a man who had not gotten what he came for. Later, when they were alone, Andrew came to the back of the room where she was sorting the new intake manifests and said, without particular drama, "Hargrove came to tell me I should reconsider employing you." "I gathered that," Julia said. "I told him it was not his concern." "I heard that part. I wanted you to know directly," Andrew said. He looked at her with those gray eyes that were simply there, not performing anything. "Because I imagine you have heard a great deal of things second-hand and third-hand, and I would rather things between us be straightforward." Julia stopped sorting the manifests and looked at him. There was something very still in the room suddenly, in the way that things go still when something important is being said simply. "Thank you," she said. "That matters to me more than you probably know." "I think I know," he said. He went back to his desk, and she went back to the manifests, and neither of them said anything more about it. But the room felt different after that, slightly warmer, as though a window had been opened to let in the spring air. It was into the second week of May when Julia was making her way back from the general store, where she had gone to pick up a supply of ink for the office, and she heard voices behind the livery stable that were recognizably trouble. Not the trouble of violence exactly, but the trouble of cruelty, which she had come to consider equally serious in its own way. 3 men, none of whom she recognized well, were speaking to a young woman of perhaps 20 who was pressed against the stable wall with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that movement attracted more attention. The men were not threatening violence in any overt sense, but they were speaking in the particular way that men speak when they want a woman to understand that her standing in the world is low and that they enjoy knowing it. Julia stopped walking. She considered her options with the speed of a person who had had occasion to do this kind of calculation before. She was not physically imposing. She had no firearm, which would have been excessive in any case. She had a bottle of ink in her hand and a voice that had never been small. "Excuse me," she said, walking toward the group with the deliberate purposefulness of someone who belonged exactly where she was going. "I am looking for Martha Jennings. Is she here?" She did not know any Martha Jennings. But the introducing of a fictional third party was a technique she had learned from a woman in Albuquerque who had been a great deal cleverer than the men who had underestimated her. And it worked now as it had worked then. It disrupted the established dynamic. It gave the woman against the wall an excuse to move, and it required the men to make a decision about whether they wanted to escalate in a new direction. The men looked at Julia with the particular displeasure of interrupted cruelty, and then, calculating something in the way that unpleasant people calculate when they sense they are in a situation that might have witnesses, they walked away with the specific kind of casual stride that was meant to look like their own idea. The young woman against the wall was named Clara Briggs, and she was Tommy's older sister, 19 years old, who had come into town to pick up supplies for the farm. She was shaking slightly, not from fear exactly, but from the particular vibration that comes from anger held inside a situation that will not permit its expression. "Thank you," Clara said, with the directness of a person who did not waste words on elaboration. "Those men know better," Julia said. "They know they can get away with it," Clara said, which was the more accurate assessment, and Julia acknowledged it. She walked with Clara to the general store and helped her load her supplies into the wagon, and when Clara drove away, she lifted a hand in a gesture that was not quite a wave but something adjacent to it. The acknowledgement between people who understand certain things without having to explain them. When she told Andrew about it that afternoon, not dramatically, simply as information about the town, he listened with the focused attention he gave to everything, and she could see something shift in his expression, a tightening around the jaw that was not quite anger but was something in the same family. "Those men are hired by Hargrove," he said. "They have been a problem before." He paused. "Clara Briggs is Tommy's sister. I know, he has mentioned her." "I will speak to the sheriff," Andrew said. He said it the way he said everything consequential, not as a declaration, but as a simple statement of what was going to happen next. "The sheriff listens to you?" Julia asked. "Ben Yates is a reasonable man. He does not like Hargrove's people either." He looked at her steadily. "You handled that well." "I have had practice," she said, and there was enough edge in it that she heard it herself and almost smiled at the sound of it. Andrew looked at her for a moment with something she could not quite classify, something that lived between concern and admiration, and something else she did not look at directly yet. "I imagine you have," he said. The spring deepened into early summer, and Harlan Creek became the particular version of itself that small western towns became in the heat, slower in the middle of the day, louder in the evenings, the dust rising in golden clouds whenever the wind came through from the south. Julia had been at Holloway's freight and supply for nearly 6 weeks, and something had changed in the town's attitude toward her, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the incremental way that small communities shift when a thing proves to be different from what they had been told. She had reorganized Andrew's entire record system, and the efficiency of his operation had improved visibly enough that 2 of his freight clients had mentioned it to people in town, because that was the kind of thing that was news in a place where one business's success or failure had ripple effects through the whole economy of the settlement. Purvis at the general store had come in one afternoon, ostensibly to discuss a shipment of hardware goods, and had stayed to look at the new filing system with the look of a man who was revising a previous estimate. She had also, over the course of those 6 weeks, done several things that had nothing to do with her official employment, and everything to do with the kind of person she was. She had helped Ma Denny's neighbor, old Hector Salinas, write a letter to the Territorial Land Office about a disputed fence line, because her Spanish was passable, and his English was better but his handwriting was not. And together, they had produced something that was both clear and polite and had apparently been effective, because Hector had come by Ma Denny's 3 weeks later with a jar of preserved chilies and the kind of gratitude that does not require translation. She had started teaching reading on Saturday afternoons to 3 of the town's children whose parents worked too hard to manage it themselves, which she did without asking for payment and without announcement, because she had needed to do something with her Saturday afternoons, and this was the most useful she could think of. None of this was performed. She was simply being who she was, in the way that people simply are when they are no longer spending all their energy on surviving. Andrew noticed. She knew he noticed because he was a person who noticed things, who paid attention to the world around him with a quality of observation that was careful without being intrusive. He noticed when she stayed late to finish a set of accounts rather than leaving them until tomorrow. He noticed when she solved a problem that had nothing to do with her official function simply because the problem was there and the solution was visible to her. He noticed when she was tired, though she never said she was tired, and on those days he made a habit of ensuring that the midday meal was particularly substantial, which she came to understand was his way of doing something about it without making a thing of it. She noticed things about him in return. She noticed that he was generous in a very specific way, not the generosity of someone who wanted to be seen being generous, but the kind that was simply a function of his character, like the way he made sure Tommy Briggs had Sundays off and paid him on Fridays rather than waiting for the month's end, so that the boy could send money home to his mother at a consistent interval. The way he paid his freight drivers slightly above the standard rate because, as he explained to her when she asked about it while reviewing the payroll, a person who feels fairly treated is less likely to be careless with cargo. She noticed that he carried something heavy in him that he did not talk about. It was not visible in his manner. He was composed, organized, capable, but it was there in the occasional quality of his stillness when he looked out the window at the end of the day, something in his eyes that was looking further than the street below. She did not ask about it. She knew something about carrying things that other people didn't need to understand, and she respected the same principle in him. It was Tommy who told her, with the complete absence of tact that was one of his more consistent characteristics, one afternoon when Andrew had ridden out to check on a delayed freight delivery and left the two of them to mind the supply house. "Did Mr. Holloway ever tell you about his wife?" Tommy said, in the tone of someone who thought this was a natural conversational transition from whatever they had been discussing before, which had been the weight capacity of freight wagons. Julia looked up from the manifest she was noting. "No," she said carefully. "She died," Tommy said. "About 2 years before I started working here, so I never met her. He doesn't talk about it much, but Ma Denny told my mother about it. Her name was Ruth. She got sick in the winter, some kind of fever that came through." He paused, carrying the freight wagon thought in one hand and the grief in the other with the simplicity of someone who had not yet learned to be subtle about the weight of things. "That's why he works so hard," Ma Denny says. "Keeps busy." Julia looked at the manifest for a long moment without seeing it. "Thank you for telling me," she said, which was both true and the best thing she could think of to say. She thought about it on the walk back to Ma Denny's that evening. She thought about what it meant to be someone who had loved a person and lost them to something as arbitrary and final as winter fever. And she thought about how Andrew Holloway moved through his days with such self-contained competence. And she understood now the particular quality of his stillness that she had noticed at the window. He was not unhappy, not exactly, but he was incomplete in the way that a person who has been cut down to half their previous space is incomplete functional, even thriving in many ways, but aware of the missing portion. She found, to her own surprise, that she wanted to fill some of that space. Not in a presumptuous way, not in a way that presumed more than she had any grounds to presume, but she wanted to, she simply did. The wanting itself surprised her, because she had spent the last year not wanting things, deliberately, carefully, as a form of self-protection. It was in July, on a particular Thursday afternoon, that something between them shifted in a direction that was unmistakable to both of them and was not discussed for another 2 weeks after it happened. Andrew had asked her to accompany him to a meeting with a freight client on the northern edge of town, a rancher named Beaumont, who was considering contracting with Holloway's for a series of large supply shipments, and who had specifically asked to meet the person managing the records after hearing about the improvements to the operation. It was professional, it made perfect sense, and yet walking beside Andrew through the warm July afternoon on the dusty road toward Beaumont's ranch, Julia was aware of something in the air between them that had not been there 6 weeks ago. They talked on the walk about the Beaumont contract, the logistics, the pricing, the scheduling challenges. Andrew explained his thinking and she responded with hers, and it was, as it always was, a conversation between two people who were equally in possession of their own thoughts and who genuinely found each other's thoughts interesting. This was something she had not experienced in her marriage, where Gerald had been polished and charming and had listened to her opinions with the attentive smile of someone who was filing them away to be used rather than considered. At some point, the road narrowed and Andrew walked on the outside, the side closer to the road, without making any particular gesture or comment about it, simply adjusting his position, and Julia became aware that she was warm in a way that had nothing to do with the July sun. The meeting with Beaumont went well. Beaumont was a large, direct man with a gray mustache and the kind of dry humor that comes from decades of practical problem-solving, and he asked Julia several questions directly and received her answers with the appreciative attention of someone who recognized competence. He signed a preliminary agreement with Andrew before they left, and on the walk back into town, Andrew said, "That went better than I expected." "He is a practical man," Julia said. "He cares about whether the system works, not about who built it." "Unlike some people in this town," Andrew said. "Unlike some people in this town," she agreed. There was a moment then, in the golden afternoon light with the dust rising around their boots and the sound of the far-off ranch behind them, when Andrew stopped walking and looked at her, and she stopped because he had, and they looked at each other in the way that people look at each other when they have been dancing around something for long enough that the dancing has become its own kind of acknowledgement. "I want to say something," Andrew said. "All right," Julia said. "I'm not sure I'm going to say it well." "I think you underestimate yourself," she said, which was true and which she suspected he knew was true. He looked at her for another moment. "I think a great deal of you," he said, "more than is strictly professional. I wanted you to know that, and I wanted you to know it from me directly because—" He stopped, started again. "Because you deserve to be told things directly." Julia looked at the road and then back at him, and she felt the thing in her chest, that same loosening that she had felt on the first afternoon, but larger now, more complicated with more threads in it. "I think a great deal of you as well," she said. "More than I expected to when I walked into your supply house. More than I thought I was going to allow myself to." She paused. "I am not yet sure what to do with it." "Neither am I," Andrew said. "But I thought you should know it was there." They walked the rest of the way back to town in a silence that was not uncomfortable but was full of something, and Julia spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about what he had said, and the way he had said it, and whether she was being sensible or foolish to feel the way she felt, and whether sensible and foolish were even the right categories for this kind of thing. The following days had the particular quality of awareness between two people who have said something, and not yet said the next thing. Every conversation carried a slight extra weight, not an unpleasant weight but a meaningful one, and Julia found herself noticing things she had always noticed, but now noticed more consciously. The way Andrew's voice was different when he was explaining something he genuinely cared about, lower and more careful. The way he moved through the supply house with the ease of someone for whom a space had been made by his own consistent presence. She was reorganizing the upper shelf of the filing room one afternoon when she heard raised voices from the front of the building. One of them Andrew's, the other one she recognized after a moment as Hargrove's. She came to the top of the stairs and listened, not from nosiness but from the practical instinct that Hargrove's visits had never yet been benign. Hargrove was not threatening Andrew. Hargrove was not precisely the kind of man who threatened directly. He was the kind who suggested, who implied, who arranged things in such a way that the correct conclusion arrived apparently on its own. He was saying something about a freight license, about a review by the territorial office, about how certain concerns had been raised with certain people in the capital. Julia stood at the top of the stairs and felt cold anger move through her. She recognized this technique. This was what had happened to her through Gerald, not outright violence, but the careful application of pressure through official-seeming channels, the weaponization of bureaucracy. She came down the stairs. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, in a tone she had developed during the last year, not loud, not angry in any visible way, but carrying a quality of complete composure that some people found more unsettling than anger. "I wonder if you are aware that the territorial freight regulations require any complaint against a licensed operation to be submitted in writing to the territorial office in Santa Fe, with the complainant's name attached. Anonymous complaints are not accepted. I wonder also if you are aware that I have very good handwriting and an extensive familiarity with how territorial office records work." Hargrove looked at her. There was something in his expression that she had seen before in men who had underestimated her, a recalculation, not comfortable. "This is none of your business," he said. "I work here," Julia said. "That makes it my business." Hargrove looked at Andrew, who was looking at him with the calm, unhurried expression of a man who had nothing to hide and knew it. "Think carefully about what you are doing," Hargrove said, to Andrew specifically, which they all understood to be a reference to employing Julia, and then he left. Andrew looked at Julia for a moment after the door swung shut behind him. "You know territorial freight regulations," he said. "I know a great many regulations," she said. "I spent a year learning every regulation I could find in case any of them were useful." She paused. "I may have also been somewhat more direct with him than was strictly advisable." "No," Andrew said, and there was something in his voice that she had not heard before, the warm edge of something that was not quite a laugh but was what came before one. "That was exactly right." He smiled, and it was the first time she had seen him smile completely. Not the small, contained, almost smile she had seen before, but the full thing, which changed his whole face, made him look younger and less careful and like a person who had been waiting for something to be worth smiling about. She found herself smiling back, and it felt like something opening. The summer moved forward through its heat and its dust and its long evenings, and the thing between them deepened at the pace of things that are built carefully, not slow from hesitation, but slow from honesty, from the mutual understanding of two people who had been hurt by things going wrong and who were, by instinct and by choice, taking care. They found themselves spending time together beyond the hours of the working day with increasing regularity and decreasing pretense. Andrew had a habit of riding in the evenings, when the heat had softened and the light was at its best, and he had begun asking her, at first occasionally and then consistently, if she would like to join him. She had told him honestly that she had not ridden in over a year, and he had said, without any condescension, "Then we will start where you are," which she found to be a perfectly good description of how she wanted things to go in general. They rode out into the territory in the long evenings and talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when they are learning each other in the way you learn a landscape, not systematically, but by moving through it and allowing its details to accumulate. She told him about growing up in Kansas before her family moved west, about her father who had been a school teacher and who had taught her to love books and arithmetic with equal enthusiasm. She told him about the year after her acquittal, the moving from town to town, not with bitterness but with the straightforwardness that she had found was the only way to carry hard things without being crushed by them. He told her about Missouri, about coming west with his Uncle Frank and learning the freight business from the ground up, loading and unloading crates and driving wagons through weather that had no patience for inexperience. He told her about Ruth, And he did it in the careful, honest way of a person who has decided that honesty is the only respectful approach to grief. Not performing the grief for her benefit, not minimizing it, but telling her who Ruth had been. A woman from Las Cruces who had been bright and sharp-humored and had died in February 2 years ago, and that Andrew had built his grief into the structure of his work, and carried it that way because he did not know a better method. "I am not over it," he said, on an evening in August when they were sitting on the bank of the small creek that gave the town its name, the horses grazing behind them and the sky going purple above the distant mesa. "I do not think you entirely get over things like that, but I am not," he paused, looking for the word. "I am not submerged in it anymore. I can see over the top of it." "I understand that," Julia said. "Not the same grief, not the same situation, but the idea of being able to see over the top of something." He looked at her in the purple evening light with those gray eyes that she had come to think of as belonging to a person who was genuinely present, who was actually there in whatever moment he was in. "Julia," he said. "Yes," she said, which was both an answer to the unspoken question and something else, and she knew it was both. He reached over and took her hand, which he held with the same quality of deliberateness that he applied to everything, carefully, fully, without hesitation or performance. She let him, and then she turned her hand over and held his back, and they sat like that for a while in the evening with the creek moving quietly over its stones and the horses contentedly destroying whatever grass was available. And Julia thought that this was what the loosening had been for this exact moment. This hand, this creek, this sky. He kissed her eventually, the way he did everything consequential, directly, without performance, with absolute sincerity. And she kissed him back in the same way, and it was neither dramatic nor small but simply the natural arrival of something that had been traveling toward them for months. "I have been wanting to do that for some time," he said, which she found deeply satisfying as a declaration. "I know," she said. "How long have you known?" "About a month," she admitted. "I have been obvious," he said, with a quality of mild self-reproach that was also faintly amused. "Only to me," she said, "and I was looking." He laughed, the full laugh this time, warm and unguarded, and she heard it and thought that she wanted to keep hearing that laugh for a very long time. The fall came to Harlan Creek, the way it always came to that part of New Mexico territory. Not with the dramatic color changes of more northern places, but with a sharpening of the air and a quality of light that was different from summer's blunt gold, cleaner and more angled, so that the shadows were longer and the mornings were cold in a way that made the coffee particularly important. Their courtship, if that was the right word for something that had always felt more like a natural progression than a formal sequence of events, became a known thing in Harlan Creek without either of them having announced it. Because, in a town of 300 people, two people who spent every working day together, and most of their evenings together, did not require an announcement. Ma Denny had said, with the tone of someone confirming what they had already known for some time, "I suppose you two have sorted yourselves out," which was her version of a congratulation, and which Julia received as warmly as any other form. Tommy Briggs's response had been more exuberant, and had involved a brief, completely unnecessary display of enthusiasm that had knocked a stack of freight manifests off the work table, which Andrew had observed with the expression of a man who was too pleased about the underlying situation to be genuinely annoyed about the manifests. Hargrove, who had made 2 more attempts to cause difficulties for Andrew's business through various back-channel means, had found both attempts efficiently neutralized, once by Julia's letter to the territorial office, which was thorough and precisely documented, and once by Sheriff Ben Yates, who had turned out to be exactly as reasonable as Andrew had described, and who had apparently had enough of Hargrove's particular brand of small-town influence peddling to welcome the opportunity to address it directly. The second attempt had involved a legal matter about the freight license that had been resolved in Andrew's favor within 3 weeks, and after that, Hargrove had shifted his energy toward other targets, which was not a victory, but was a sufficient one for present purposes. The three men who had cornered Clara Briggs had been spoken to by Sheriff Yates with enough directness that they had found reasons to spend time in other towns, which was perhaps not a permanent solution to the underlying problem, but was a practical one for the time being. In October, Beaumont signed the full freight contract, which was the largest single contract Holloway's had held, and Andrew took Julia and Tommy to dinner at the town's one reasonable restaurant to mark the occasion. And over the course of that dinner, with Tommy eating with the complete concentration of a 17-year-old who has been promised a good meal, Andrew reached across the table and took Julia's hand in the same way he had taken it at the creek, and said, "I have been thinking about asking you something." "Then ask it," Julia said, with the directness that he had always appreciated in her. "I would like you to marry me," he said. "I know that is not a particularly elegant way to put it. I thought about saying it more elegantly, but the thing about elegant ways of saying things is that they put so much decoration on top of the actual meaning that the meaning sometimes gets buried. So I am saying it plainly. I would like you to marry me, and to stay in Harlan Creek, and to build something here together. And I would like it because you are the most capable and honest person I have known, and because the world makes more sense with you in it than it did without you, and because I am in love with you, and I think I have been for quite some time." Julia looked at him across the table in the warm lamplight of the restaurant, and she thought about the day she had stepped off the stagecoach with $2.30 and a reputation that had preceded her, and she thought about standing in the doorway of his supply house with the afternoon light behind her and him saying that the town's opinion was not his hiring policy, and she thought about all the evenings and the mornings and the slow, honest building of something real. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you. Because you gave me work when I asked for work, and you gave me respect along with it, and I have spent 6 months not knowing which of those two things meant more to me, and I have decided that the answer is that they are the same thing. They are both you. So yes." Tommy, who had been pretending not to listen with complete lack of success, made a sound that might have been a cheer and knocked over his water glass, which seemed to be the natural consequence of Tommy Briggs experiencing strong emotion. They were married in November, in the church with the peeling white paint, which had been repainted since the spring because the minister's wife, whatever her private opinions about Julia, was a woman who did not permit peeling paint to persist indefinitely. The ceremony was small. Ma Denny was there, and Tommy, and Clara Briggs, who had come in from the farm with her mother, and Sheriff Ben Yates, and old Hector Salinas, who arrived with a second jar of chilies as a wedding gift, and stood in the back with the dignified composure of a man who considered himself a friend of the family. Julia wore a dress that she and Ma Denny had made together from fabric ordered from Santa Fe deep blue, the color of the sky at that particular hour just after sunset that was neither day nor dark. And Andrew wore his best coat and had shaved carefully, and looked at her walking down the short aisle between the pews with the expression of a man who was in the specific present moment entirely. Not anywhere else, not in Missouri, or in Las Cruces, or in the complicated territory of grief. But exactly here, exactly now. She stood beside him at the front of that church with the morning light coming through the plain glass windows and the smell of candle wax and wood and the faint cold of New Mexico November, and she felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was standing in a place that was hers. Not borrowed, not temporary, not conditional on what anyone else decided to think about her. Hers. When the minister asked his questions, she answered them in a clear, steady voice, and so did Andrew. And when he took her hand to put the ring on it, a simple gold band bought in Santa Fe during a freight trip 2 weeks before, he held her hand the way he always held it, with that quality of complete intention, as though holding her hand were a thing worth doing correctly. They walked out of the church into the cold, bright November morning as husband and wife, and Ma Denny embraced Julia with the firmness of someone who has decided to express affection through structural integrity. And Tommy tried to say something congratulatory, and produced instead a kind of sustained, enthusiastic noise that conveyed the meaning without the words. And Clara Briggs smiled at Julia with the specific smile of one woman, acknowledging another woman's good fortune, in a way that also acknowledges the work it took to arrive at it. They had a supper that evening at the supply house, which was cleared of freight crates and set with tables and covered in the kind of food that appears when a small community decides that something is worth celebrating. Pies brought by neighbors Julia had not known well but who had come to know her over the course of the year. Bread from Ma Denny. A roasted joint from the rancher Beaumont who had come himself with his wife. A stout woman named Adeline who pulled Julia into a hug with the easy confidence of someone who had decided to like a person and was not uncertain about that decision. Andrew danced with Julia in the cleared center of the supply house, which had never been intended as a dance floor but functioned as one adequately, to music provided by a fiddle player named Santos, who was technically one of Andrew's freight drivers, but who played the fiddle with such skill that it seemed like the primary occupation. They danced together with the ease of two people who had learned each other well, who knew how the other moved, and the supply house was warm with lamplight and the noise of people who were genuinely glad, and Julia looked up at Andrew's face and thought, "This is the thing I did not expect." Not the dance, not the warm room, not the people, but the specific fact of being glad. She had not expected to be glad again, and she was, thoroughly and without reservation, glad. The winter settled in, and the world of Harlan Creek contracted to its cold, close version: fewer riders on the road, the freight routes reduced to the essentials, more evenings spent inside by the stove with the work that accumulated in any operation that was growing, because Holloway's freight and supply was growing, quietly and steadily, the way that things grow when the foundation has been properly laid. Julia moved her work home in the evenings, sitting at the kitchen table in the house that she and Andrew now shared, his house, which had been Ruth's house too, which she had entered with the respect due to a space that carried history, and which she had made, slowly and without erasure, also her own. She had put her books on the shelf beside his. She had planted something in the kitchen garden in the spring. She had made curtains for the front windows from the same blue fabric as her wedding dress, and Andrew had looked at them when she hung them and said, "They are the same color as what you wore when you married me." And she had said, "I know," and he had understood that this was intentional. She kept thinking in the early months of their marriage about the quality of what they had built. It was not the kind of love that she had read about in the sentimental novels that had circulated among the women she had known before everything went wrong, not the kind that consumed you or lifted you out of yourself into some ecstatic and non-functional state. It was better than that. It was the kind that made the ordinary things more worth doing. It was the kind that made her feel more like herself, not less, which was the thing she had not known to look for and which she recognized, now that she had it, as the rarest and most important quality a love could have. Andrew was a wonderful husband in all the specific, practical ways that counted more than people usually acknowledged. He was fair. He was honest, consistently and without drama. He respected her opinions and her capabilities without performing his respect, the way people who don't genuinely feel it tend to perform it. He was affectionate in the quiet, present way that she had come to understand was his nature, not demonstrative in public displays, but in the thousand small attentions that constituted actual intimacy. The coffee made the way she liked it, the freight manifest left on her desk with a note attached when something had come in that he thought would interest her, the evenings sitting beside her with a book while she worked, not talking, simply there. By February, when the cold was at its deepest and the freighting business was at its quietest, and there was more time than usual for the kind of stillness that allows certain things to be noticed, Julia discovered that she was expecting a child. She told Andrew on a Sunday evening in the kitchen, sitting across the table from him after supper, with the directness that she brought to everything. He looked at her for a moment with the focused attention that she recognized as his version of taking something fully in, and then something crossed his face that she had not seen before, a complexity of emotion that included joy in an unguarded, immediate form, and something that she recognized, after a moment, as the particular quality of a person who has been afraid for a long time of wanting something, and who is now, cautiously, allowing themselves to want it. He stood up and came around the table and put his arms around her in the way that felt less like an embrace and more like something structural, like the way a building holds its most important thing. "Are you well?" he asked, his voice at that lower register she associated with the things that mattered most to him. "I am well," she said. "I feel fine. I think I have felt fine for several weeks, and I was waiting to be certain before I said anything." "That is like you," he said into her hair, and she could feel the smile in it. "Is it? You wait until you are certain. It is one of the things I love about you." She held on to him in the kitchen with the fire in the stove and the cold pressing at the windows and the blue curtains moving slightly in the draft from the door, and she thought that she was going to have to completely revise her understanding of what her life was allowed to be, because it appeared it was allowed to be this. The spring came again, as it always did, with the same quality of return that springs always have, the same but not the same, everything slightly further along, slightly more established. The vegetable garden Julia had started last year was more productive this year. The Beaumont freight contract had led to 2 more large contracts. Tommy Briggs had been given a raise and a small amount of supervisory responsibility that he was carrying with touching seriousness. Clara Briggs had come to help in the supply house 2 days a week, which Julia had suggested, and Andrew had immediately agreed to. And Clara had turned out to have a facility for the organizational systems that Julia had put in place that suggested she might, with time and proper opportunity, be managing operations of her own. Julia was showing by April in a way that could not be missed, and the town's relationship with her had by this point traveled far enough from where it had been in the spring of the previous year that the visible evidence of her pregnancy was met with the kind of practical warmth that small communities extend to one of their own. Adeline Beaumont came by with a collection of baby clothes. Ma Denny produced a quilt in the blue and white and yellow pattern that she seemed to have made her signature, which Julia received with the same quiet, deep feeling that she had received the first one, that particular response to being cared for that you have when you have been a long time without it. Even Purvis at the general store had become, over the course of the year, something approaching an ally, not effusive but reliable, which she valued more. He had given her once an approving nod when she walked in, and for Purvis, this was approximately equivalent to a standing ovation. On a hot afternoon in late July, Julia gave birth to a son. He arrived with the particular urgency of children who have decided on their own schedule, in the bedroom of the house on the south side of Main Street, with the midwife, a calm, capable woman named Mrs. Espinoza, who had delivered approximately 200 children in and around Harlan Creek, and approached the process with the efficient serenity of complete expertise, and Ma Denny, who had appointed herself present on the grounds that she was present, and that was that. Andrew was in the front room, which was where husbands were in 1879 in New Mexico territory, and when the cry came, that particular cry, the first one, the announcement, he was through the bedroom door before anyone could tell him otherwise, and Mrs. Espinoza said something reproving in Spanish, and Ma Denny said something more emphatic in English, and Andrew stood at the foot of the bed and looked at Julia with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, because it was the face of a person from whom every careful composure had simply fallen away, leaving something completely unguarded and astonished and full. She looked back at him from the bed, tired in every cell, holding this new person who was entirely himself, and already looking around at the world with the focused, serious expression of someone who had arrived with intentions. "Come here," she said. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms, and he held him with the same quality of intention that he held everything that mattered to him, completely and carefully, and looked down at this small face that was Andrew's face and her face and entirely its own face, and said nothing for a long moment. "He is remarkable," Andrew said finally. "He is," Julia agreed. "What shall we call him?" They had discussed names for months, in that pleasant, sprawling way of people who are anticipating something wonderful and are in no hurry to narrow it down. They had a list, but the list had always been theoretical, and now that they were looking at an actual person, the theory needed to meet the reality. "Frank," Julia said, which she had been thinking for the last several hours but had not said until now. Andrew looked at her. She could see what the name meant to him, his uncle, the man who had given him the chance to build something. "Frank," he said, trying it on the way you try on a word that is also a tribute. "Frank Holloway." "Frank Holloway," she confirmed. He bent his head over the baby for a moment in a gesture that was privacy and grief and gratitude and love in the same motion, and Julia put her hand on his arm and let it be all of those things at once. Frank Holloway was a serious baby, which suggested either that he took after his father or that he was simply taking the new world seriously, which seemed reasonable. He was healthy and loud when he chose to be loud, which was not always when his parents preferred, and he had, from very early, a quality of watching everything around him with absorbed attention that made Julia think of Andrew at the ledger, of that same stillness in the face of something interesting. The months that followed were full in the way that life is full when you have a child and a business and a house and a community, full in a way that is tiring and rich and occasionally chaotic. Tommy Briggs, who had initially regarded Frank with the careful uncertainty of a teenage boy who has been presented with a baby, had by Frank's third month developed the specific enthusiasm of a person who has realized that babies are interesting, and that being trusted with one is a significant responsibility that he was, actually, very capable of. He would walk Frank around the supply house on the days Julia brought him in, showing him the freight crates with explanatory commentary that Frank attended to with the serious focus of a scholar. Clara Briggs, who had been promoted to full-time by the summer, turned out to be exactly as talented as Julia had suspected, and Julia began training her in the full record-keeping system with the intention that Clara would be capable of managing it entirely. This was not an act of generosity, but an act of sense. Julia had plans for the operation that required distributing the administrative capacity, and Clara was the right person for the part she was needed to fill. Andrew had watched this training with approval, and one evening in the autumn, when Frank was 4 months old and sleeping in the cradle by the fire with the complete dedication that babies bring to sleep, and Julia was reviewing the month's accounts at the kitchen table, Andrew sat down across from her and said, "Tell me about the plans." She looked up at him. "What plans?" "The plans you have been working out in your head for the last 2 months. I can tell you have plans because you get a particular expression when you are working out something complicated." "What expression?" "The same one you had when you first looked at my manifests. Like you have found a system problem and are already 3 steps into the solution." She looked at him with something warm moving through her, that he knew that expression, that he had noticed it long enough to recognize it. She told him the plans. They were about expansion, not reckless, not the kind of expansion that outran the capacity to manage it, but the kind based on the Colorado partnerships that Andrew had been corresponding about for the last year and a half. A second supply operation in a town to the north that was growing because of the cattle trade. A freight route that connected the 2 operations and allowed them to share resources in a way that improved both. Clara managing the second location once she was fully trained, which she would be by spring. Andrew listened to the whole thing with the focused attention that was his best quality, and then asked the questions he always asked, the specific, intelligent ones that showed he had been actually listening rather than performing listening. He asked about the financial projections, and she showed him the figures she had been working with. He asked about the risk on the second location, and she had an answer for that. He asked about Clara's readiness, and she had a thoughtful answer for that too. "I think we should do it," he said. "So do I," she said. He smiled at her across the kitchen table in the firelight, with Frank sleeping in the cradle beside them, and she smiled back. And it was in that moment, quiet, domestic, particular, that she thought about what she would say if someone asked her to identify the happiest she had ever been. She had once thought the answer would be something larger, some moment of vindication, some public restoration of what had been taken. But the answer turned out to be this: a kitchen in November, a fire in the stove, the sound of a sleeping baby, a husband smiling at her across a table, and the plans for the next thing spread between them like a map of the future they were going to build together. The years that followed were the years that matter most, the ones that are not dramatic but are real, the ones built of accumulated mornings and decisions and small graces and ordinary hard work. They were the years in which Holloway's Freight and Supply became Holloway and Wilcox Supply Company, because Julia had said when they were drawing up the partnership documents for the second location that her name should be on the business, and Andrew had said it should have been on it from the first year. And they had not argued about it because there was nothing to argue about. She had built it as much as he had, and they both knew it. Clara Briggs managed the second location in the town of Sangrev, 20 miles north, with the competence that Julia had always known she possessed. And in her first year, she increased the operations client list by 4 new contracts and reorganized the storage system in a way that Julia found elegantly efficient and told her so directly. Clara was, by 22, the kind of businesswoman that the territory produced occasionally when it allowed women the space to become one, and she did not take it for granted, which was the mark of a person who understood where opportunity came from. Tommy Briggs, at 20, decided that he wanted to learn the driving end of the freight operation rather than the administrative end, and had become Andrew's most reliable freight driver, which he did with the wholehearted enthusiasm he brought to everything, and which also allowed him to send considerably more money home to his mother's farm, which had been paying off its debt steadily for 3 years. Sheriff Ben Yates had run for a second term and won it, which was good for the town in general and particularly good for the maintenance of the relative peace that had replaced the Hargrove era. Hargrove himself had sold the saloon and moved to Texas after the legal matter with the freight license had thoroughly damaged his credibility in Harlan Creek, which was not precisely justice, but was a satisfying practical outcome. Old Hector Salinas had died the winter of 1881, peacefully, at an age that was either 82 or 87 depending on which document you consulted, and Julia had attended the funeral and stood with his family and brought food in the custom of the community, because he was part of the web of this place that was hers. In the spring of 1881, Frank Holloway turned 2 and demonstrated a strong opinion about every decision made in his vicinity. He had his father's eyes and his mother's directness and a voice that was, for a 2-year-old, surprisingly authoritative. Andrew watched his son argue with the household cat about the appropriate use of the kitchen floor and said, with the expression of a man who recognized a personality, "He is going to be interesting." "He already is interesting," Julia said. "Extremely interesting," Andrew agreed, retrieving the cat from the situation with the calm efficiency of a father who had learned the value of swift intervention. That same spring, Julia told Andrew that they were expecting again, which she did with the same directness and the same sense of certainty she had brought the first time, and Andrew received this news with the same unguarded expression, that particular happiness that came from somewhere completely genuine and held her in the kitchen again, the way he had held her the first time, and she thought, this. Again. This. Their daughter was born in November of 1881, arriving with considerably more deliberateness than her brother had shown, as though she had decided exactly when she wanted to arrive, and had arranged everything accordingly. They named her Frances Ruth, which had two halves to it, Frank's uncle and Andrew's wife, and which felt exactly right, a name that held both the people who had shaped Andrew Holloway before Julia had found him, because those people mattered and their mattering did not diminish anything about the present. Frances was different from Frank in the particular way that second children demonstrate the infinite variety of even two people's combinations. She was observant and quiet and had, from very early, the quality of a person who was absorbing everything around her and filing it away for later use. She looked at the world with Julia's dark eyes and Andrew's expression, and Julia looked at her sometimes and thought about the extraordinary improbability of this particular small person existing, the chain of events that had led to this, the accusation, the acquittals, the stagecoach, the orange dust of the main street, the double doors of the supply house, the gray eyes looking up from the ledger. She thought about it and was not bitter about it, which was something she had had to work at and had eventually achieved. The story of Julia Wilcox and what had happened in Santa Fe did not disappear entirely from Harlan Creek's memory. Communities do not entirely forget, but it became, over the years, a different kind of story. Not the story of a disgraced woman, but the story of a woman who had come to town under difficult circumstances and had built something remarkable, which was a story the town preferred because it reflected well on the town's own judgment. The people who had refused her in those first days were not confronted about this, because Julia had no interest in confrontations for their own sake. They were simply part of the landscape of the place, and the landscape of the place had changed around them. Purvis, at the general store, by 1882, regularly asked Julia's opinion on his own account-keeping problems, which he did with the specific combination of practicality and understated respect that was his highest form of regard. Ma Denny, who had become something closer to family than neighbor over the years, had a standing arrangement to come to Sunday supper every week, and was, by this point, regarded by Frank and Frances as a fixed feature of their world in the way that beloved older people become fixed features. In the summer of 1882, Julia and Andrew sat on the front porch of the house in the warm evening, the way they had developed the habit of sitting in the evenings when the children were asleep and the day's work was finished, watching the light go out of the sky over the mesa in the particular way it went in New Mexico, gradually, with great beauty, taking its time. Frank was 4 and Frances was 8 months, and the business had just signed its largest contract yet with a cattle operation that ran between Harlan Creek and the Texas border. "I want to tell you something," Andrew said. "Then tell me," Julia said. "I have been thinking about what you said the night I asked you to marry me. About not knowing which meant more, the work or the respect." She looked at him. The light was going gold and then amber, and the sky behind the mesa was becoming the particular deep blue that reminded her of her wedding dress. "I have been thinking," he said, "that I want you to know that I knew, even then when you walked in and asked for work and stood there telling me exactly who you were and what had happened, with your carpet bag and your $2.30 and your completely indestructible sense of who you were. I knew, even then, that you were the most extraordinary person I had met in a very long time. I did not offer you work as a charity. I offered you work because I needed the best person I could find, and you walked through my door." Julia looked at him in the gold and amber light and felt the thing that she had first felt in the boarding house room at Ma Denny's, sitting on the edge of the bed with the quilt in its blue and white and yellow squares, that careful, profound loosening, the fist of a year's worth of endurance slowly, finally, opening. "I know," she said. "I wanted to say it directly," he said. "Because you deserve to have things said directly. You always say things directly," she said. "It is one of the things I love about you most." He reached over and took her hand, as he had taken it at the creek 4 years ago, and she held it back as she had then, and they sat on the porch together in the fading summer evening, with the children sleeping inside and the mesa turning purple and the town of Harlan Creek settling into its night sounds. The horses in the livery, the distant sound from the direction of the saloon, the creek over its stones at the south edge of town. She thought about all the days, all the manifests and the accounts and the ledgers and the freight routes and the contracts and the small cruelties overcome and the small kindnesses accumulated, and the child who had his father's eyes and the child who had her own, and the blue curtains in the front window and the vegetable garden, and the quilt in its blue and white and yellow, and the coffee in the mornings, and the evenings at the creek, and the dance in the supply house, and the November morning, when she had walked down the aisle of the church with the peeling paint, and felt for the first time in a year and a half that she was standing in a place that was hers. She thought about asking only for work and being given work and respect, and the long, slow revelation that both of those had been, from the first moment, the same thing. The recognition that she was a person of worth and capability, and that her worth was simply assumed, not conditional, not granted as a favor, but there, present, recognized, the way things that are simply true are present and recognized. She had spent a long time not knowing which had meant more, the work or the respect. She knew now that they were not two things but one, and that the one thing was Andrew Holloway looking up from his ledger with those gray eyes that were simply there, attentive and honest, saying, "Tell me what you can do," and she had told him, and he had listened, and everything that followed had followed from that. The evening completed itself around them, the sky going from amber to purple to the deep dark blue that is nearly black, the first stars appearing over the mesa with the quiet certainty of things that have always been there. Frank would wake up early and want breakfast with the urgent authority of a small person who is very clear about what he needs. Francis would wake and be fed and look around at the world with those wide, observant eyes. The freight manifests would need doing. The Beaumont contract renewal was coming up. Clara Briggs had written about a possible new client in Sangreve. Tommy's birthday was next month and she had been thinking of what to get him. All of this would be there tomorrow. The work and the life around the work, and the man beside her holding her hand in the dark, and the children sleeping inside, and this town that had become, against the odds and through sustained effort, and with the particular grace of a person who had arrived at work and been given work and had stayed because she had been given, along with it, the rare and necessary dignity of being known accurately and valued honestly. This was her life. All of it, completely and without reservation, hers. She held Andrew's hand in the dark and was glad, and the stars came out over the mesa one by one, and the creek moved over its stones, and Harlan Creek settled into its quiet, and Julia Wilcox Holloway, who had once asked only for work and had been given work and respect, and all the extraordinary consequences of both, breathed in the warm night air and let herself have it fully, without apology or restraint or the long habit of not expecting too much. She had the whole thing. She was going to keep it, and she did.